Hello, this is Tony Walker, and I'm about to read you a classic detective story. As you can probably tell from the breathing and the ums and ahs, I'm human, not AI. This is John Dickson Carr's story, a very talented writer, very funny writer, called The Footprint in the Sky. The Footprint in the Sky by John Dickson Carr. She awoke out of confused dreams, awoke with a start, and lay staring at the white ceiling of her bedroom for a minute or two before she could convince herself it was anything but a dream. But it was a dream. The cold, brittle sunlight poured in at the open window. The cold, brittle air blowing the curtains stirred a light coating of snow on the windowsill. It stirred briskly in that little bare room. It should have set the blood racing, and Dorothy Brant breathed it deeply. Everything was all right. She was at the country cottage, where she and Dad and Harry had come down for the skating on the frozen lake, possibly even a little mild skiing if the snow came on according to the weather forecast. And the snow had fallen. She should have been glad of that, though for some reason the sight of it on the windowsill struck her with a kind of terror. Shivering in the warm bed, the clothes pulled up about her chin, she looked at the little clock on her bedside. 20 minutes past 9. She had overslept. Dad and Harry would be wanting their breakfast. Again she told herself that everything was all right, though now, fully awake, she knew it was not. The unpleasantness of yesterday returned. Mrs. Topham next door, that old shrew and thief as well. It was the only thing which could have marred this weekend. They had looked forward to the skating, the crisp blades thudding and ringing on the ice, the flight, the long scratching drag as you turned, the elm trees black against the clear cold sky. But there was Mrs. Topham, with her stolen watch and her malicious good manners, huddled up in the cottage next door and spoiling everything. Put it out of your mind. No good brooding over it. Put it out of your mind. Dorothy Brant braced herself and got out of bed, reaching for her dressing gown and slippers. But it was not her dressing gown she found, draped across the chair. It was her heavy fur coat. And there were a pair of soft leather slippers. They were a pair of soft leather moccasins, ornamented with beadwork, which Harry had brought back from the States. But now the undersides were cold, damp, and stiff, almost frozen. That was when a subconscious fear struck at her, took possession, and would not leave. Closing the window, she padded out to the bathroom. The small cottage, with its crisp white curtains and smell of old wood, was so quiet that she could hear voices talking downstairs. It was a mumble in which no words were distinguishable. Harry's quick tenor, her father's slower and heavier voice, and another she couldn't identify, but which was the slowest and heaviest of all. What was wrong? She hurried through her bath and through her dressing. Not only were they up, but they must be getting their own breakfast, for she could smell coffee boiling. And she was very slow. In spite of 9 hours' sleep, she felt as edgy and washed out as though she'd been up all night. Giving a last jerk of the comb through her brown bobbed hair, putting on no powder or lipstick, she ran downstairs. At the door of the living room she stopped abruptly. Inside were her father, her cousin Harry, and the local superintendent of police. "Good morning, miss," said the superintendent. She never forgot the look of that little room, or the look on the faces of those in it. Sunlight poured into it, touching the bright-coloured, rough-woven rugs and rough stone fireplace. Through side windows she could see out across the snow-covered lawn to where, 20 yards away, and separated from them only by a tall laurel hedge with a gateway, was Mrs. Topham's white weather-boarded cottage. But what struck her with a shock of alarm as she came into the room was the sense of a conversation suddenly cut off. The look she surprised on their faces when they glanced round, quick and sallow, as a camera might have surprised it. "Good morning, miss," repeated Superintendent Mason, saluting. Harry Ventnor intervened in a kind of agony. His naturally high colour was higher still. Even his large feet and bulky shoulders, his small sinewy hands looked agitated. "Don't say anything, Dolly," he urged. "Don't say anything. They can't make you say anything. Wait until—" "But I certainly think—" began her father slowly. He looked down his nose and then along the side of his pipe, everywhere except at Dorothy. "I certainly think," he went on, clearing his throat, "that it would be as well not to speak hastily until—" "If you please, sir," said Superintendent Mason, clearing his own throat. "Now, miss, I'm afraid I must ask you some questions, but it's my duty to tell you that you need not answer my questions until you have seen your solicitor." "Solicitor? But I don't want a solicitor. What on earth should I want with a solicitor?" Superintendent Mason looked meaningly at her father and Harry Ventnor as though bidding them to mark that. "It's about Mrs. Topham, miss." "Oh. Why do you say, oh? Go on, please. What is it?" "I understand, miss, that you and Mrs. Topham had words yesterday. A bit of a dust-up, like." "Yes, you could certainly call it that." "May I ask what about?" "I'm sorry," said Dorothy. I can't tell you that. It would only give the old cat an opportunity to say I've been slandering her." "So that's it. What's she been telling you?" "Why, miss," said Superintendent Mason, taking out a pencil and scratching the side of his jaw with it, "I'm afraid she's not exactly in a condition to tell us anything. She's in a nursing home at Guildford, rather badly smashed up round their head. Just between ourselves, it's touch and go whether she'll recover." First, Dorothy couldn't feel her heart beating at all, and then it seemed to pound with enormous rhythm. The superintendent was looking at her steadily. She forced herself to say, "You mean she's had an accident?" "Not exactly, miss. The doctor says she was hit 3 or 4 times with that big glass paperweight you may have seen on the table at her cottage." "Eh? You don't mean somebody did it deliberately? But who did it?" "Well, miss," said Superintendent Mason, looking at her still harder until he became a huge Puritan face with a small mole beside his nose, "I'm bound to tell you that by everything we can see so far, it looks as though you did it." This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Afterward, she remembered in a detached kind of way, studying all of them, the little lines round Harry's eyes in the sunlight, the hastily brushed light hair, the loose leather wind jacket whose zip fastener was half undone. She remembered thinking that despite his athletic prowess he looked ineffectual and a little foolish. But then her own father wasn't of much use now. She heard her own voice. "But that's absurd." "I hope so, miss. I honestly hope so. Now, tell me, were you out of this house last night?" "When?" "At any time." "Yes, no, I don't know. Yes, I think I was." "For God's sake, Dolly," said her father, "don't say anything more until we've got a lawyer here. I've telephoned to town. I didn't want to alarm you. I didn't even want to wake you. There's some explanation for this. There must be." It was not her own emotion. It was the wretchedness of his face which held her. Bulky, semi-bald, worried about business, worried about everything else in this world. That was John Brand. His crippled left arm and black glove were pressed against his side. He stood in the bright pool of sunlight, a face of misery. "I've seen her," he explained. It wasn't pretty. "Not that I haven't seen worse in the war." He touched his arm. "But you're a little girl, Dolly. You're only a little girl. You couldn't have done that." His plaintive tone asked for confirmation. "Just one moment, sir," interposed Superintendent Mason. "Now, miss, you tell me you were outside the house last night?" "Yes." "In the snow?" "Yes, yes." "Do you remember the time?" "No, I don't think so." "Tell me, miss, what size shoes do you wear?" "4." "That's a rather small size, isn't it?" When she nodded dumbly, Superintendent Mason shut up his notebook. "Now, if you'll just come with me." The cottage had a side door. Without putting his fingers on the knob, Mason twisted the spindle round and opened it. The overhang of the eaves had kept clear the 2 steps leading down, but beyond a thin coating of snow lay, like a plaster over the world, between here and the shuttered cottage across the way. There were 2 strings of footprints in that snow. Dorothy knew whose they were. Hardened and sharp printed, one set of prints moved out snakily from the steps, passed under the arch of the powdered laurel hedge, and stopped at the steps of the side door of Mrs. Topham's house. Another set of the same tracks, a little blurred, spaced at longer intervals where the person had evidently been running desperately, came back from the cottage to these steps. That mute sign of panic stirred Dorothy's memory. It wasn't a dream. She had done it. Subconsciously, she had known it all the time. She could remember other things: the fur coat clasped round her pyjamas, the sting of the snow to wet slippers, the blind rush in the dark. "Yours, miss?" inquired Superintendent Mason. "Yes. Yes, they're mine." "Easy, miss," muttered the superintendent. "You're looking a bit white round the gills. Come in here and sit down. I won't hurt you." Then his own tone grew petulant, or perhaps something in the heavy simplicity of the girl's manner penetrated his official bearing. "But why did you do it, miss? Lord, why did you do it? That's to say, breaking open that desk of hers to get a handful of trinkets not worth 10 quid for the lot. And then not even taking the trouble to mess up your footprints afterward." He coughed, checking himself abruptly. John Brandt's voice was acid. "Good, my friend, very good. The first sign of intelligence so far. I presume you don't suggest my daughter is insane?" "No, sir, but they were her mother's trinkets, I hear." "Where did you hear that? You, I suppose, Harry?" Harry Ventnor pulled up the zip fastener of his wind jacket as though girding himself. He seemed to suggest that he was the good fellow whom everybody was persecuting, that he wanted to be friends with the world, if they would only let him. Yet such sincerity blazed in his small features that it was difficult to doubt his good intentions. "Now look here, old boy, I had to tell him, didn't I? It's no good trying to hide things like that. I know that just from reading those stories." "Stories? All right, say what you like. They always find out, and then they make it worse than it really was." He let this sink in. "I tell you, you're going about it in the wrong way. Suppose Dolly did have a row with the Topham about that jewellery. Suppose she did go over there last night. Suppose those are her footprints. Does that prove she bashed the Topham? Not that the public service wasn't done, but why couldn't it have been a burglar just as well?" Superintendent Mason shook his head. "Because it couldn't, sir." But why? I'm asking you, why?" "There's no harm in telling you that, sir, if you'll just listen. You probably remember that it began to snow last night at a little past 11 o'clock. No, I don't. We were all in bed by then." "Well, you can take my word for it," Mason told him patiently. "I was up half the night at the police station, and it did. It stopped snowing about midnight. You'll have to take my word for that too, but we can easily prove it. You see, sir, Mrs. Topham was alive and in very good health at well after midnight. I know that too, because she rang up the police station and said she was awake and nervous and thought there were burglars in the neighbourhood. Since the old lady does that same thing," he explained with a certain grimness, "on the average of about 3 times a month, I don't stress that. What I am telling you is that her call came in at 12:10, at least 10 minutes after the snow had stopped." Harry hesitated, and the superintendent went on with the same patient air. "Don't you see it, sir? Mrs. Topham wasn't attacked until after the snow stopped. Round her cottage now there's 20 yards of clean, clear, unmarked snow in every direction. The only marks in that snow, the only marks of any kind at all, are the footprints Miss Brandt admits she made herself." Then he rose at them in exasperation. "'Tisn't as though anybody else could have made the tracks, even if Miss Brandt didn't admit it herself. I'm absolutely certain nobody else did. You, Mr. Vender, wear size 10 shoes. Mr. Brandt wears size 9, walk in size 4 tracks. Ah! And yet somebody did get into that cottage with a key, bashed the old lady pretty murderously, robbed her desk, and got away again. If there are no other tracks or marks of any kind in the snow, who did it? Who must have done it?" Dorothy could consider it now in almost a detached way. She remembered the paperweight with which Mrs. Topham had been struck. It lay on the table in Mrs. Topham's stuffy parlour, a heavy glass globe with a tiny landscape inside. When you shook the glass globe, a miniature snowstorm rose within, which seemed to make the attack all the more horrible. She wondered if she had left any fingerprints on it. But over everything rose Reenie Topham's face. Reenie Topham, her mother's bosom friend. "I hated her," said Dorothy, and unexpectedly she began to cry. Denison Jameson of the law firm of Morris, Farnsworth and Jameson, Lincoln's Inn Fields, shut up his briefcase with a snap. He was putting on his hat and coat when Billy Farnsworth looked into the office. "Hello," said Farnsworth. "You off to Surrey over that Brant business?" "Yes." Believe in miracles, do you?" "No." "That girl's guilty, my lad. You ought to know that." "It's our business," said Jameson, "to do what we can for our clients." Farnsworth looked at him shrewdly. "I see in your ruddy cheek. Quixotry is alive again. Young idealist storms to relief of good looker in distress, swearing to—" "I've met her twice," said Jameson. "I like her, yes, but merely using a small amount of intelligence on this, I can't see that they've got such a thundering good case against her." "Oh, my lad." "Well, look at it. What do they say the girl did? This Mrs. Topham was struck several times with a glass paperweight. There are no fingerprints on the paperweight, which show signs of having been wiped. But after having the forethought to wipe her fingerprints carefully off the paperweight, Dorothy Brant then walks back to her cottage and leaves behind 2 sets of footprints, which could be seen by aerial observation a mile up. Is that reasonable?" Farnsworth looked thoughtful. "Maybe they would say she isn't reasonable," he pointed out. "Never mind the psychology. What you've got to get round are the physical facts. Here is the mysterious widow Topham entirely alone in the house. The only servant comes in by day. Here are one person's footprints. Only that girl could have made the tracks, and in fact admits she did. It's a physical impossibility for anybody else to have entered or left the house. How do you propose to get round that?" "I don't know," said Jameson rather hopelessly. "But I want to hear her side of it first. The only thing nobody seems to have heard, or even to be curious about, is what she thinks herself." Yet when he met her at the cottage late that afternoon, she cut the ground from under his feet. Twilight was coming down when he turned in at the gate, a bluish twilight in which the snow looked grey. Jameson stopped a moment at the gate and stared across at the thin laurel hedge dividing this property from Mrs. Topham's. There was nothing remarkable about this hedge, which was some 6 feet high and cut through by a gateway like a Gothic arch. But in front of the arch, peering up at the snow-coated side of the hedge, just above it, stood a large figure in cap and waterproof. Somehow he looked familiar. At his elbow, another man, evidently the local superintendent of police, was holding up a camera, and a flashbulb glared against the sky. Though he was too far away to hear anything, Jameson had a queer impression that the large man was laughing uproariously. Harry Ventnor, whom he knew slightly, met Jameson at the door. "She's in there," Harry explained, nodding toward the front room. Don't upset her, will you? Here, what the devil are they doing with that hedge?" He stared across the lawn. "Upset her?" said Jameson with some asperity. "I'm here, if possible, to help her. Won't you or Mr. Brant give some assistance?" "You honestly think that Miss Brant, in her rational senses, could have done what they say she did?" "In her rational senses?" repeated Harry. After looking at Jameson in a curious way, he said no more. He turned abruptly and hurried off across the lawn. Yet Dorothy, when Jameson met her, gave no impression of being out of her rational senses. It was her straightforwardness he'd always liked, the straightforwardness which warmed him now. They sat in the homely firelit room, by the fireplace over which were the silver cups to denote Harry's athletic and gymnastic prowess, and the trophies of John Brant's earlier days at Summer Ritz. Dorothy herself was an outdoor girl. "To advise me," she said. "You mean to advise me what to say when they arrest me?" "Well, they haven't arrested you yet, Miss Brant." She smiled at him. "And yet I'll bet that surprises you, doesn't it? Oh, I know how deeply I'm in. I suppose they're only poking about to get more evidence. And then there's a new man here, a man named March from Scotland Yard. I feel almost flattered." Jameson sat up. He knew now why that immense figure by the hedge had seemed familiar. Not Colonel March? Yes, rather a nice person, really, answered Dorothy, shading her eyes with her hand. Under her light tone he felt that her nerves were raw. "Then again, they've been all through my room, and they can't find the watch and the brooch and the rings I'm supposed to have stolen from Aunt Reenie Topham. Aunt Reenie! So I've heard. But that's the point. What are they getting at? A watch and a brooch and a couple of rings. Why should you steal that from anybody, let alone from her?" "Because they weren't hers," said Dorothy, suddenly looking up with a white face and speaking very fast. "They belong to my mother." "Steady." "My mother's dead," said Dorothy. "I suppose it wasn't just the watch and the rings, really. That was the excuse, the breaking point, the thing that brought it on. My mother was a great friend of Mrs. Topham. It was Aunt Reenie this and Aunt Reenie that, while my mother was alive to pamper her. But my mother wanted me to have those trinkets, such as they were. Dear Aunt Reenie Topham coolly appropriated them, as she appropriates everything else she can. I never knew what had happened to them until yesterday. Do you know that kind of woman? Mrs. Topham is really charming, aristocratic and charming, with the cool charm that takes all it can get and expects to go on getting it. I know for a fact that she's really got a lot of money, though what she does with it I can't imagine. And the real reason why she buries herself in the country is that she's too mean to risk spending it in town. I never could endure her. Then, when my mother died and I didn't go on pampering Aunt Reenie as she thought I should, it was a very different thing. How that woman loves to talk about us, Harry's debts and my father's shaky business. And me. She checked herself again, smiling at him. "I'm sorry to inflict all this on you." "You're not inflicting on me." "But it's rather ridiculous, isn't it?" "Ridiculous," said Jameson grimly, "is not the word I should apply to it. So you had a row with her?" "Oh, a glorious row, a beautiful row, the grandmother of all rows." "When?" "Yesterday, when I saw her wearing my mother's watch." She looked at the fire over which the silver cups glimmered. "Maybe I said more than I should have," she went on, "but I got no support from my father or Harry. I don't blame Dad. He's so worried about business, and that bad arm of him troubles him so much sometimes that all he wants is peace and quiet. As for Harry, he doesn't really like her, but she took rather a fancy to him, and that flatters him. He's a kind of male counterpart of Aunt Reenie. Out of a job? Well, depend on somebody else. And I am in the middle of all this. It's Dolly do this and Dolly do that, and good old Dolly, she won't mind, but I do mind. When I saw that woman standing there, wearing my mother's watch, and saying commiserating things about the fact that we couldn't afford a servant, I felt that something ought to be done about it. So I suppose I must have done something about it." Jameson reached out and took her hands. "All right," he said. "What did you do?" "I don't know. That's just the trouble." "But surely—" "No! That was one of the things Mrs. Topham always had such sport with. You don't know much when you walk in your sleep. Ridiculous, isn't it?" she went on after another pause. "Utterly ridiculous. But not to me, not a bit. Ever since I was a child, when I've been overtired or nervously exhausted, it's happened. Once I came downstairs and built and lit a fire in the dining room and set the table for a meal. I admit it doesn't happen often, and never before with results like this." She tried to laugh. "But why do you think my father and Harry looked at me like that? That's the worst of it. I really don't know whether I'm a near murderer or not." This was bad. Jameson admitted that to himself, even as his reason argued against it. He got up to prowl round the room, and her brown eyes never left him. He couldn't look away. He saw the tensity of her face in every corner. "Look here," he said quietly, "this is nonsense. Oh, please, don't you say that. It's not very original." "But do you seriously think you went for that woman and still don't know anything about it now? Would it be more difficult than building a fire?" "I didn't ask you that." Do you think you did it? No, said Dorothy. That question did it. She trusted him now. There was an understanding and sympathy between them, a mental force and communication that could be felt as palpably as the body gives out heat. Deep down inside me, no, I don't believe it. I think I should have waked up. And there was no blood on me, but how are you going to get round the evidence? The evidence, always the evidence. I did go across there. I can't deny that. I remember half waking up as I was coming back. I was standing in the middle of the lawn in the snow. I had on my fur coat over my pajamas. I remember feeling snow on my face and my wet slippers under me. I was shivering, and I remember running back. That's all. If I didn't do it, how could anyone else have done it? I beg your pardon, interposed a new voice. Do you mind if, both figuratively and literally, I turn on the light? Dennis Jameson knew the owner of that voice. There was the noise of someone fumbling after an electric switch. Then, in homely light, Colonel March beamed and basked. Colonel March's 17 stone was swathed round in a waterproof as big as a tent. He wore a large tweed cap. Under this his speckled face glowed in the cold, and he was smoking with gurgling relish the large bowled pipe which threatened to singe his sandy moustache. "Ah, Jameson," he said. He took the pipe out of his mouth and made a gesture with it. "So it was you. I thought I saw you coming in. I don't want to intrude, but I think there are at least 2 things that Miss Brant ought to know." Dorothy turned round quickly. "First," pursued Colonel March, "that Mrs. Topham is out of danger. She is at least able, like an after-dinner speaker, to say a few words, though with about as much coherence. Second, that out on your lawn there is one of the queerest objects I ever saw in my life." Jameson whistled. "You've met this fellow," he said to Dorothy. "He's the head of the Department of Queer Complaints. When they come across something outlandish, which may be a hoax or a joke, but on the other hand may be a serious crime, they shout for him. His mind is so obvious that it hits every time. To my certain knowledge, he's investigated a disappearing room, chased a walking corpse, and found an invisible piece of furniture. If he goes so far as to admit that the thing is a bit unusual, you can look out for squalls." Colonel March nodded quite seriously. "Yes," he said, "that is why I'm here, you see. They thought we might be interested in that footprint." "That footprint?" cried Dorothy. "You mean—" No, not your footprint, Miss Brant. Another one. Let me explain. I want you, both of you, to look out of the window. I want you to take a look at the laurel hedge between this cottage and the other. The light's almost gone, but study it." Jameson went to the window and peered out. "Well," he demanded, "what about it? It's a hedge." "As you so shrewdly note, it is a hedge. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think a person could walk along the top of that hedge?" "Good Lord, no." "No? Why not?" "I don't see the joke," said Jameson, "but I'll make the proper replies. Because the hedge is only an inch or 2 thick, it wouldn't support a cat. If you tried to stand on it, you'd come through it like a ton of bricks." "Quite true. Then what would you say if I told you that someone weighing at least 12 stone must have climbed up the side of it?" Nobody answered him. The thing was so obviously unreasonable that nobody could answer. Dorothy Brant and Dennis Jameson looked at each other. "For," said Colonel March, "it would seem that somebody at least climbed up there. Look at the hedge again. You see the arch cut in it for a gate? Just above that, in the snow, along the side of the hedge, there are traces of a footprint. It is a large footprint. I think it can be identified by the heel, though most of it's blurred and sketchy." Walking quickly and heavily, Dorothy's father came into the room. He started to speak, but seemed to change his mind at the sight of Colonel March. He walked over to Dorothy, who took his arm. "Then," insisted Jameson, "somebody did climb up on the hedge." "I doubt it," said Colonel March. "How could he?" Jameson pulled himself together. "Look here, sir," he said quietly. "How could he is correct. I never knew you to go on like this. But I don't care if somebody climbed up on the hedge. I don't care if he danced the tango on it. The hedge leads nowhere. It doesn't lead to Mrs. Topham's. It only divides the two properties. The point is, how did somebody manage to get from here to that other cottage across 60 feet of unbroken snow without leaving a trace on it? I ask you that because I'm certain you don't think Miss Brant is guilty." Colonel March looked apologetic. I know she isn't," he answered. In Dorothy Brant's mind was again that vision of the heavy paperweight, inside which, as you shook it, a miniature snowstorm arose. She felt that her own wits were being shaken and clouded in the same way. "I knew Dolly didn't do it," said John Brant, suddenly putting his arm round his daughter's shoulder. "I knew that. I told them so, but—" Colonel March silenced him. "The real thief, Miss Brant, did not want your mother's watch and brooch and chain and rings. It may interest you to know what he did want. He wanted about £1,500 in notes and gold sovereigns tucked away in that same shabby desk. You seem to have wondered what Mrs. Topham did with her money. That's what she did with it. Mrs. Topham, by the first words she could get out in semi-consciousness, was merely a common or garden variety of miser. That dull-looking desk in her parlour was the last place any burglar would look for a hoard. Any burglar, that is, except one." "Except one?" repeated John Brant, and his eyes seemed to turn inward. A sudden ugly suspicion came to Jameson. "Except one who knew. Yes, you, Miss Brant, had the blame deliberately put on you. There was no malice in it. It was simply the easiest way to avoid pain and trouble to the gentleman who did it. Now, hear what you really did, Miss Brant," said Colonel March, his face darkening. "You did go out into the snow last night, but you did not go over to Mrs. Topham's, and you did not make those two artistic sets of footprints in the snow. When you tell us in your own story that you felt snow sting on your face as well as underfoot, it requires no vast concentration surely to realize that the snow was still falling. You went out into it like many sleepwalkers. You were shocked into semi-consciousness by the snow and the cold air, and you returned long before the end of the snowfall, which covered any real prints you may have made. The real thief, who was very much awake, heard you come back and tumbled into bed. He saw a heaven-sent opportunity to blame you for a crime you might even think you had committed. He slipped in and took the slippers out of your room, and when the snow had stopped, he went across to Mrs. Topham's. He didn't mean to attack her, but she was awake and surprised him, and so, of course, Harry Ventnor struck her down." "Harry!" The word, which Dorothy had said almost at a scream, was checked. She looked round quickly at her father. Then she stared straight ahead. Then she began to laugh. "Of course," said Colonel March, "as usual, he was letting his good old Dolly take the blame." A great cloud seemed to have left John Brant, but the fussed and worried look had not left him. He blinked at Colonel March. "Sir," he said, "I would give my good arm to prove what you say. That boy has caused me half the trouble I ever had. But are you raving mad?" "No. I tell you he can't have done it. He's Emily's son, my sister's son. He may be a bad lot, but he's not a magician." "You are forgetting," said Colonel March, "a certain size 10 footprint. You are forgetting that interesting sight, a smeared and blurred size 10 footprint on the side of a hedge which would not have held up a cat. A remarkable footprint. A disembodied footprint." "But that's the whole trouble," roared the other. "The 2 lines of tracks in the snow were made by a size 4 shoe. Harry couldn't have made them any more than I could. It's a physical impossibility. Harry wears size 10. You don't say he could have got his feet into flat leather moccasins which would fit my daughter." "No," said Colonel March, "but he could get his hands into them." There was a silence. The Colonel wore a dreamy look, almost a pleased look. "And in this unusual but highly practical pair of gloves," the Colonel went on, "Harry Ventnor simply walked across to the other cottage on his hands. No more than that. For a trained gymnast, as those silver cups will indicate, it was nothing. For a rattle-brained gentleman who needed money, it was ideal. He crossed in a thin coating of snow which would show no difference in weight. Doorsteps, cleared of snow by the overhanging roof, protected him at either end when he stood upright. He had endless opportunities to get a key to the side door. Unfortunately, there was that rather low archway in the hedge. Carrying himself on his hands, his feet were carved up and back over the arch of his body to balance him. He blundered and smeared that disembodied footprint on the side of the hedge. To be quite frank, I'm delighted with the device. It is a crime upside down. It is leaving a footprint in the sky. It is— "Fair cop, sir," concluded Superintendent Mason, sticking his head in at the door. "They've got him on the other side of Guildford. He must have smelled something wrong when he saw us taking photographs, but he had the stuff on him." Dorothy Brant stood looking for a long time at the large, untidy blimp of a man who was still chuckling with pleasure. Then she joined in. "I trust," observed Dennis Jameson politely, "that everybody is having a good time. For myself, I've had a couple of unpleasant shocks today, and just for a moment I was afraid I should have another one. For a moment I honestly thought you were going to pitch on Mr. Brant." "So did I," agreed Dorothy, and beamed at her father. "That's why it's so funny now." John Brant looked startled, but not half so startled as Colonel March. "Now there," the Colonel said, "I honestly do not understand you. I am the Department of Queer Complaints. If you have a ghost in your attic or a footprint on top of your hedge, ring me up. But a certain success has blessed us because, as Mr. Jameson says, I look for the obvious, and Lord love us, if you have decided that a crime was committed by a gentleman who could walk on his hands, I will hold under torture that you are not likely to succeed by suspecting the one person in the house who has a crippled arm."
If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to.
John Dickson Carr was a really interesting guy. Born in 1906, died in 1997. So he was born in November, 30th of November, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And his father was Wooder, spelled W-O-O-D-A, Nicholas Carr, a U.S. congressman, who was also a lawyer, I think. His early education, this is John Dickson Carr, was at the Hill School in Pottstown, where he developed a fascination with crime fiction. He later attended Haverford College, graduating in 1929. You may say Haverford. During his youth, Carr was deeply influenced by Gaston Leroux's The Mystery of the Yellow Room, which was widely regarded as the first major locked room mystery. And he also liked G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown stories. He is reputedly, and I think arguably, the master of the impossible crime story, or usually a locked room crime story. But we say a little bit more about those, but you probably know about them anyway. But this is, in a sense, this story here was the crime is delivered to us. This is the crime. Even the young woman is, because she knows she has a history of sleepwalking and not remembering what she's done when she's been sleepwalking, she suspects herself. She knows in her heart. That's very interesting, isn't it? How we have two senses. We know rationally and we feel intuitively. So her rational sense tells her that it is, in all probability, she did murder this Renee or Renee, whatever her name was, Topham, and bashing her with a snow globe. Fair way to go if you've got to go. Very pretty. I like snow globes. I don't know if I If I've got to be attacked by any blunt object, and I don't really want to be, but just let's say it had to happen. I think a snow globe, particularly one with the yellow, the gold snow inside. Anyway, so the story is given to us. Even she thinks she did it. She intuitively knows she didn't, but the facts, and I suppose that's the dichotomy, isn't it? How the facts point in one direction in these stories, but we just know intuitively that this is not the case, whatever the facts say. And that's how we buy things, isn't it? That's how we vote. We do everything through feeling. We do very little through thinking, despite kidding ourselves that we do. Now, when I was reading this story, I was reminded of a case that I studied when I was doing my psychology degree. So, famous case, Kenneth Parkes, who was 23 and he was a Canadian from Pickering, Ontario. And this is a true story. In the early hours of the 24th of May 1987, Parkes, while purportedly sleepwalking, so he claimed to be sleepwalking, drove, obviously sleep driving, drove approximately 20 kilometres, I don't know what that is in miles, to the home of his in-laws in Scarborough, Ontario. Upon arrival, he attacked his mother-in-law, Barbara Ann Woods, fatally bludgeoning her with a tire iron and stabbing her, not with a snow globe. Note. He also assaulted his father-in-law. It's not funny, Tony, shut up. Attempting to strangle him, though he survived the attack, the father-in-law. After the incident, Parkes, covered in blood, drove to a nearby police station and confessed, stating, "I think I've just killed 2 people." During his trial, Parkes presented a defence of automatism, claiming he was sleepwalking and thus not conscious during the event. Medical experts supported this claim, testifying that he was indeed sleepwalking at the time and suffered from a sleep disorder rather than a psychiatric illness. The jury, get this, acquitted him of the charges, a decision upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1992. This landmark ruling has since been a pivotal reference in cases involving sleepwalking as a legal defence. So it's not so crazy as you'd think. You can, don't do it though. You know, they'll know if you weren't really sleepwalking. If you're just using it as an excuse, you're not going to get away with it. Especially if you cite this case immediately, you drive to the police station covered in blood and go, "I know I've just killed some people, but I'm just like Kenneth Parkes." You're not going to get away with it, so don't do it. But this, of course, the Kenneth Parkes case was much, much later than this story, but it's interesting, isn't it? So then, still quite a young man, he married an English woman in 1931 called Clarice Cleves and moved to England. Reminds me suddenly of a Ryan Adams, not Brian, but Ryan Adams song called English Girls. And he talks about how English girls break your heart, and they certainly broke mine many times. But I did a lot better with Scottish, Welsh and Irish girls. So, English girls, yeah, they've broken my heart, but not John Dickson Carr's. No, everything went well. I don't know if that's true or not. I've only got the mildest of clues here. But anyway, he loved British culture, and he loved. Notice that switch between English and British there, and detective stories. So although he could have written kind of American detective stories, but he chose to. Raymond Chandler went the other way, of course, didn't he? He was an English writer who chose to write American detective stories in America. And John Dickson Carr. Now, an interesting thing linguistically, which you might not get, that his writing is very British, except there are 2 things that give it away, and you might not notice this unless you read a lot of both English or British English and American English stories. I don't know how the Canadians fall on this one, actually, to be fair. But the British always tend to write towards or inwards, whereas the Americans will say inward and toward, and that's a big giveaway. And the other one is round and around. So he walked around the house, whereas British English writers will tend to write he walked round. Even Agatha Christie, even the Virginia Woolf, they will write round, not around. Now, if you have a grammar checking program, it will tell you that round is incorrect, but it isn't. It's around is an American English usage. So stand up for yourself with your Grammarly checker if you want to write British English and you say, no, round is perfectly acceptable. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit today, but we'll get back to the point at some point. So so he was actually one of only 2 Americans ever admitted to the prestigious detection club. You know, Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and all the gang were involved in that. Of course, detective writers, not in this story, tend to have a detective that is larger than life, and the story is, I've said many times, is sold very often on the personality for many. I mean, think of Sherlock, think of Hercule Poirot, but there's loads of them. Lord Peter Wimsey, whatever. And John Dickson Carr's detectives were most famously Dr. Gideon Fell, my mother's maiden name, Fell. First appearance in a book called Hag's Nook, 1933. And this is a large, genial Englishman with a massive and tidy hair, often seen wearing a shovel hat and a cloak, and he walks with the aid of 2 canes because he's rather large and has poor nobility. And he's an eccentric, boisterous character, occasionally absent-minded, based on G.K. Chesterton, the creator of Father Brown. And he's like Chesterton's Father Brown, he's very psychological. And he has the Hollow Man, 1935, very famous, features the famous locked room lecture whereby Dr. Fell explains different solutions to impossible crimes. Probably one to read if you haven't read it. Dr. Henry Merivale, H.M., appears in The Plague Court Murders in 1934, which Dickson Carr wrote under a pseudonym, Carter Dickson. And he's gruff, bold, bespectacled, and also overweight man with a majestic corporation, pot belly. And a funny thing they call that around here is a dialect word or a slang word. They call it a kite, if you have a big kite. Now, I don't know how wide a word that is. It might be like a Northern English one, or who knows. Anyway, so The Judas Window, 1938, one of the best locked room mysteries ever written. Merivale argues that a simple window can be deadlier than a locked door. And there's a whole bunch of them. She Died a Lady, 1943, a mystery with one of Carr's best surprise endings. Then there was a French detective, Henri Bencolin, don't know. A Parisian magistrate detective, a Grand Inquisiteur, more than a traditional detective, very similar to Poe's famous detective, C. Auguste Dupin. Often investigates gothic and macabre crimes. And then, of course, we have, who features in this story, Colonel March of Scotland Yard. Now, this is from a book called The Television Detectives Omnibus, and it's a collection of stories of detectives that have been filmed. And so, of course, Dr. March was filmed between 1954 and 1955, Colonel March of Scotland Yard. And the man who played him was Boris Karloff. Amazing. So my voice still keeps going after my cold. So Colonel March of Scotland Yard, the Department of Queer Complaints, 1940. That word has, of course, acquired a completely different meaning now. Anyway, let's not go into that. I'm just wondering about their funding these days, whether they would be funded, whether there'd be special dispensation, who knows. So a quiet, reflective investigator with a keen sense of logic, again, a rather big man, and overweight, So what's all this about? I don't think from his pictures that John Dickson Carr looks particularly corpulent, but his detectives were. So the New Invisible Man case involves a vanishing man, the silver curtain, an impossible murder behind a locked door, and the crime in nobody's room. The other thing that he did, he wrote standalone, but he was a pioneer of historical detective stories. So The Bride of Newgate was a historical mystery. The Devil in Velvet of historical fiction. Time travel, because he was also interested in time travel. But very interesting stuff, isn't it? But so he was a fantastic pioneer, really prolific writer, as you can tell, a very ingenious writer, and a very, I narrate a lot of stories, and his style was a delight. It was all there without being overwritten. It was really, really well done. In the Second World War, he was still in Britain, and he wrote a lot with the BBC radio scripts, mystery narratives, and also propaganda content aimed at bolstering public morale during the so-called challenging war years, when we were on our uppers. So notable creation of this time was the Cabin B-13, which came out in 1943, was later made into a series in the US by CBS. He apparently worked with British intelligence during that time, but what he did has not ever come out. He also collaborated with Adrian Conan Doyle's, Arthur Conan Doyle's son, and created a series of stories called The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes, a collection of pastiches based on hints left in the original Holmes stories. And he wrote a biography of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So this guy is, he is massively knowledgeable and learned about this. He had a stroke in 1963 and he was partially paralyzed, but he continued to write using one hand. He also contributed to a regular column, The Jury Box, in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and he was a reviewer. He moved back to the US and moved to Greenville, South Carolina, where he died of lung cancer in February 1977, aged 70. Now, he was very well regarded. Kingsley Amis regarded Dr. Fell, one of his characters, as the three great successors to Sherlock Holmes. You're going to wonder who the other two were. They were Father Brown and Nero Wolfe. And Dorothy L. Sayers, no less, said of him, Mr. Carr can lead us away from the small, artificial, brightly lit stage of the ordinary detective plot into the menace of outer darkness. He can create atmosphere with an adjective, alarm, or an illusion, or delight with a rollicking absurdity. In short, he can write. And I would concur with that. He can write. He's an excellent. The other story I've done on this channel is The House in Goblin Wood. Again, there's a big dash of humour, I think, in that it's overtly done. It's a much more humorous story. But I think he achieves his humour not through gags or even slapstick situations. It's through the characterisation. The humour comes through the people themselves, I suppose the absurdity in the last story of a man who and let's face it, there are two things that strike you. First of all, it seems that she did it, but she, when she's giving her account, says, "The snow in my face." Now, we've already been told by Inspector March that the snow had stopped by 10 p.m. and therefore they were thinking it was her because she'd gone out after the snow in her face. Now, the great thing he does there, he drops it and he leaves it. And of course, this is the skill. Do not throw extra light on things that are important, and do put extra light on things that aren't, i.e. the red herring. And as soon as I read that, I thought, aha, that is important. And the second thing was he shows us the cups very early on. The show, what's his name, the criminal Harry, his gymnastic prowess, and leaves it at that. That's it. And he actually even waters it down because they're alongside her father's trophies as well. So it's just such a light touch. But then when you come to have the story revealed to you, you have aha. And of course, I've said many times, you can't have a Deus Ex Machina at the end. You can't have it just dropped in with no foreshadowing. You have, because people feel cheated if you do that. But if you have put these, as he did, those two things, and probably some others as well, then the reader, or the listener in this case, hears them and goes, "Oh yes," and the clever listener will be going, "Oh, I knew that anyway. I had that taped from the very beginning." But I'm not sure that you would have. Maybe some of you did, but I certainly didn't think that the solution would be a gymnastic. Basically, what would we call him? He is a crook, just a chancer, isn't he? We know him. They're the people you go out for a drink with. They never have the money, and we know them. We know them. They never buy the round, and there's always an excuse. Oh yeah. You know them. I don't. What word is there for them? I'll think of one, but probably when I finish doing this. But the solution would be a man walking on his hands across the snow with his hands in size 4 moccasins. You wouldn't have thought that, would you? I mean, if you did, you have a more bizarre imagination than me. Anyway, I hope you liked it. It was a lot of fun. More detective stories soon.